The marble floors of Jake Thompson's mansion reflected the warm glow of crystal chandeliers as caterers rushed to perfect the final details. Jake stood in his master bedroom, adjusting his tailored Armani suit while his friends lounged on leather chairs, drinking aged scotch. The room reeked of privilege and expensive cologne. "You should see her face when she cleans the bathrooms," Jake said, prompting laughter from his friends. "Always so serious, like she's performing brain surgery or something." He was talking about Tasha, his housekeeper, whom he'd invited to tonight's party as part of an elaborate joke. Mark Davidson, Jake's closest friend and fellow real estate magnate, raised his glass. "Can't wait to see her try to fit in. Bet she shows up in her cleaning uniform." More laughter filled the room as Jake checked his Rolex, still 2 hours until the party. Across town, in a small but neat one-bedroom apartment, Tasha Williams stood before her mirror, examining her reflection. The dress she wore wasn't store-bought, she'd designed and sewn it herself, a fitted black number with strategic cutouts that emphasized her curves while maintaining elegance. Her hand smoothed over the fabric, checking every seam and detail. Her stomach churned with anxiety, but her face remained composed. She knew exactly why Jake had invited her. She'd overheard him planning it with his friends last week while she cleaned his study. Instead of declining, she'd accepted. She had something to prove, not to them, but to herself. Back at the mansion, the first guests began arriving. Jake welcomed them into his grand foyer, where a string quartet played classical music. He'd spared no expense, premium champagne flowed freely, caviar was served on mother-of-pearl spoons, and waiters circulated with trays of expertly crafted hors d'oeuvres. "There she is," Mark whispered to Jake as Tasha's name appeared on the guest list. "This should be good." Jake positioned himself near the entrance, surrounded by a group of influential friends, real estate developers, hedge fund managers, and tech entrepreneurs. He'd carefully orchestrated this moment, expecting to see Tasha stumble in, obviously out of place, providing entertainment for his wealthy guests. The party was in full swing now. The air buzzed with conversation and laughter, the clink of crystal glasses, and the subtle undertones of power and money. Jake checked his phone. Tasha would arrive any minute. He imagined the scene, her awkward entrance, the poorly concealed snickers, the inevitable social faux pas that would cement her status as an outsider. "Remember," he told his friends, "act natural when she comes in. We want her to feel welcome." The sarcasm in his voice was thick, and several people nearby smirked knowingly. Jake took another sip of his champagne, feeling the familiar warm buzz of alcohol and anticipated amusement. The grand double doors opened again, and Jake turned, ready for his moment of triumph. What he saw instead would change everything, but he didn't know that yet. He was still standing there, champagne in hand, wearing his practiced smile of superiority, completely unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to shift on its axis. Tasha's entrance silenced the nearby conversations. The black dress she wore caught the light perfectly, its design both sophisticated and daring. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo, and she wore a single strand of pearls, simple yet striking. She didn't shuffle in uncertainly as Jake had expected. Instead, she moved with practiced grace, her head held high. Several of Jake's business associates turned to look at her, their expressions shifting from anticipatory amusement to genuine interest. One of his most important clients, a senior partner at Goldman Sachs, actually stopped mid-conversation to watch her pass. Jake's smirk faltered. This wasn't the Tasha he knew from his house, the quiet woman in simple clothes who efficiently managed his household. This was someone else entirely, someone who commanded attention without asking for it. "Is that really her?" Mark whispered, his tone caught between disbelief and derision. "Must have spent her whole year's salary on that outfit." He laughed, but it sounded forced. A few others joined in, but their laughter lacked conviction. Tasha approached the main group, exchanging pleasantries with guests as she moved through the crowd. When someone asked what she did, she answered honestly, "I manage Mr. Thompson's household," but there was no shame in her voice, no apologetic undertone. She stated it as simply as if she'd said she was a neurosurgeon. The conversation shifted to a recent exhibition at the Whitney Museum. One of Jake's friends, attempting to highlight Tasha's presumed ignorance, asked her opinion on contemporary art. "Actually," Tasha responded, "I found their recent exploration of social hierarchy through mixed media particularly compelling. It reminded me of Basquiat's early work." Jake watched as his carefully planned humiliation backfired. Tasha wasn't just surviving the party, she was thriving. She spoke about art, literature, and current events with an ease that suggested years of self-education. When she discussed fashion with a magazine editor, her knowledge of design and fabric revealed a depth that went far beyond her role as a housekeeper. Mark, growing increasingly uncomfortable with Tasha's success, tried to reassert the social hierarchy. "It must be fascinating for you," he said loudly, "to see how the other half lives." His tone dripped with condescension. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but Tasha remained composed. "The view is certainly educational," she replied, her smile never wavering. "It's amazing what people reveal about themselves when they think they're superior." The subtle jab landed perfectly. Mark's face reddened, and he quickly excused himself to get another drink. Jake stood frozen, watching this unfold. He felt something unexpected, pride mixed with shame. Pride in Tasha's ability to handle herself with such dignity, and shame at his own petty attempt to humiliate her. He caught her eye across the room, and for a moment, their gazes locked. There was no anger in her look, no resentment, just a quiet confidence that made him feel small despite his wealth and status. The party continued around them, but something had fundamentally shifted. The woman Jake had intended to make a fool of was instead fooling them all, or perhaps showing them their own foolishness. As he watched her engage effortlessly with his guests, Jake realized he had never really known Tasha at all. And now, surrounded by all his wealthy friends and expensive decorations, he wondered what else he might have missed while focusing on appearances. The tension finally broke during a conversation near the grand piano. Mark, still smarting from his earlier embarrassment, raised his voice deliberately loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Tell us, Tasha, how does someone in your position become so cultured?" The word "position" carried all the weight of his prejudice. The surrounding conversations quieted. Guests turned to watch, some with discomfort, others with poorly concealed interest in the brewing confrontation. Jake, standing nearby, felt his chest tighten. He should step in, he knew, but something held him back. Tasha turned to face Mark fully, her posture relaxed but commanding. "My position?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "You mean as someone who works for a living? Or did you have something else in mind, Mr. Davidson?" The challenge in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. "Well," Mark continued, swirling his whiskey, "it's just surprising to find someone who cleans houses, so well versed in fine arts and culture." He smiled, but his eyes were cold. "Almost makes one wonder if you're trying to be something you're not." Jake watched Tasha's reaction, expecting, perhaps even hoping, to see her finally crack under the pressure. Instead, she smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and somehow made Mark's expression seem more like a grimace in comparison. "What fascinates me," Tasha responded, her voice carrying across the now silent room, "is how quickly some people equate wealth with worth. I clean houses, yes. I also read Proust in French, design clothes, and volunteer teaching art to underprivileged children. None of these things are mutually exclusive unless you lack the imagination to see beyond social barriers." The silence that followed was deafening. Several guests nodded appreciatively. A well-known art curator actually applauded softly. Mark's face flushed dark red, and he knocked back the remainder of his whiskey in one gulp. Jake felt an unexpected surge of pride, followed immediately by crushing shame. He had invited Tasha here to humiliate her, but she was showing more class and dignity than his supposedly sophisticated friends. More than he had shown himself. He found himself moving through the crowd toward her, not entirely sure what he would say. When he reached her, the words tumbled out awkwardly. "Tasha, I'm sorry about all this. About Mark, about everything." Tasha looked at him, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp and assessing. "Are you sorry about what's happening now, Mr. Thompson, or about why you invited me in the first place?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Around them, guests pretended not to listen while hanging on every word. Jake struggled to find a response that wouldn't make him sound worse than he already did. "I was wrong," he managed finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "About a lot of things." "Yes," Tasha agreed simply. "You were." She turned slightly away from him, a clear dismissal. "If you'll excuse me, I believe I was in the middle of a fascinating discussion about Basquiat's influence on contemporary street art." Jake watched her walk away, joining a group of genuinely interested guests. He felt oddly bereft, standing alone in his crowded mansion. For the first time in years, his wealth and status felt meaningless compared to the quiet dignity Tasha had displayed. The cool night air provided a welcome escape from the stuffiness of the party. Jake found Tasha on the marble terrace, standing alone by the ornate railing, looking out over the manicured gardens. The city lights twinkled in the distance, creating a backdrop that seemed almost too perfect. "You're not enjoying the party?" he asked, keeping his distance but close enough for conversation. It wasn't really a question, more of an attempt to break the ice. "Actually, I am," Tasha replied without turning. It's educational to see how people react when their expectations are challenged. She finally looked at him. "Why did you follow me out here, Mr. Thompson?" Jake moved closer to the railing, maintaining a respectful distance. "I want to understand something. You knew, didn't you? Why I invited you tonight? But you came anyway." "Yes." Her answer was simple, direct. "I heard you planning it with Mr. Davidson last week while I was cleaning your study. You weren't exactly subtle about it." Jake winced. "Then why come? Why put yourself through this?" Tasha turned to face him fully. "Because you and your friends aren't the only ones who can play games, Mr. Thompson. Though my goals were different." She paused, studying his face. "I wanted to show you something about assumptions. About how wrong they can be." "The dress," Jake said. "You designed it yourself?" "Yes. It's what I do when I'm not managing your household. I design. I create. I have a small studio in my apartment where I work on my collections." She smiled slightly. "I'm not just a housekeeper who got lucky with a borrowed dress, if that's what you were thinking." "Why work as a housekeeper then?" The question came out before Jake could stop himself. "Because it pays the bills while I build my brand. Because there's no shame in honest work." She looked at him challengingly. "Would you respect me more if I'd told you I was a struggling artist who refused to take a menial job?" Jake felt the conversation shifting into uncomfortable territory. "Your knowledge of art, literature, where did that come from?" "My mother was a librarian. Our house was full of books. I grew up reading everything I could get my hands on. Just because someone cleans your house doesn't mean they sprang into existence the day you hired them." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Jake looked out at the gardens, processing her words. "I've never asked you anything about yourself, have I? In all the time you've worked for me?" "No," Tasha confirmed. "You haven't. But then again, why would you? I was just part of the backdrop of your life, like your expensive furniture or your art collection. Something to maintain but not engage with." Her words stung, but Jake couldn't deny their truth. "The way you handled Mark inside, that was impressive. I've had plenty of practice dealing with people who underestimate me." She turned back to look at the gardens. Though usually they're more subtle about it. Jake's brief moment of connection with Tasha was interrupted by Mark's deliberate throat clearing behind them. "Jake, can I have a word?" His tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. Jake noticed several other friends hovering near the terrace doors, watching. Tasha straightened up. "I should check on the kitchen staff anyway," she said, her professional mask sliding back into place. She walked past Mark without acknowledging him, her head held high. Once she was gone, Mark rounded on Jake. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, keeping his voice low but intense. "You're out here having a heart-to-heart with your maid." "Housekeeper," Jake corrected automatically, surprising himself. "And we were just talking." "Just talking." Mark's laugh was harsh. "Wake up, Jake. People are starting to talk inside. You invited her here as a joke, remember? Not to actually socialize with her." Thomas Chen, another real estate developer, joined them. "Mark's right, Jake. This isn't good for your image. Half the people in there are your business associates. What message are you sending?" Jake felt his jaw tighten. "What message?" "That I can have a conversation with someone intelligent and well-spoken." "That you're losing touch with who you are," Mark shot back. "Look, we get it, she cleaned up nice and she can string together a few fancy sentences about art. But at the end of the day, she works for you. She cleans your toilets. And manages my household perfectly, Jake responded, feeling a strange need to defend her. Have you seen how she handles herself in there? She's more sophisticated than half our usual crowd. Jesus Christ, Mark muttered. Listen to yourself. What's next? Are you going to invite your gardener to the country club? Inside, through the terrace doors, Jake could see Tasha in the kitchen. She was chatting with the catering staff, laughing at something one of them said. She seemed more relaxed there, more genuine than she'd been in the main party. She doesn't belong in our world, Jake, Thomas added, his tone gentler than Mark's but no less firm. You're just confusing things by pretending otherwise. Think about your reputation. Think about the Barrett deal we're trying to close next week. Jake watched as Tasha helped one of the waiters rearrange his tray, showing him a more efficient way to balance it. The easy camaraderie she shared with the staff was obvious, and somehow more authentic than any interaction he'd had at his own party. Your father built this business on relationships, Mark pressed. The right relationships. With the right people. Are you really going to risk all that because your housekeeper can quote some artists and wore a nice dress? The mention of his father hit home. Jake had spent years building his reputation in the real estate world, carefully cultivating the right image, the right connections. He'd worked hard to be accepted in these circles, to be seen as more than just his father's son. Look, Mark said, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. Just go back inside. Mingle with the people who matter. Let her stay in the kitchen where she belongs. Tomorrow, everything goes back to normal. Jake felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He looked back into the kitchen one last time. Tasha was gone. Jake found Tasha in the kitchen's service corridor, preparing to leave. She had her coat draped over one arm, her posture suggesting she'd already made up her mind about something. You're leaving, he asked, aware of how empty the question sounded. I think I've served my purpose for the evening, she replied, her tone professional but distant. I've provided enough entertainment for your friends. That's not. Jake started, then stopped. Would you come back to the party? Please. Tasha studied him for a moment. Why? So your friends can make more thinly veiled comments about knowing my place. Or so you can prove something to yourself about being open-minded. Her directness caught him off guard. I heard what you said earlier, about assumptions. You were right. I never bothered to know anything about you. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice firm. You don't need to do this. I don't need your approval or your guilt. I came tonight to prove something to myself, not to you. And I've done that. What did you want to prove? That I could walk into a room full of people who thought they were better than me and show them they were wrong. That I could face their contempt without losing my dignity. She adjusted her coat. And I did that. I don't need to stay and watch you struggle between your conscience and your social standing. Jake felt the weight of her words. I haven't been struggling with my conscience for years, he admitted. Maybe that's the problem. Your friends are waiting for you to go back in there and pretend this evening never happened, Tasha said. To laugh it off as a joke that got out of hand. To put me back in my proper place in your world. And what if I don't want to do that? Then you need to ask yourself why, she challenged. Is it because you've had some profound realization about social equality? Or is it because I surprised you by not being what you expected, and now you're intrigued? Jake didn't have an answer. He watched as she buttoned her coat, her movements deliberate and composed. I have dreams, Mr. Thompson, she continued. Goals that don't involve being someone's social experiment or redemption story. I design clothes because I love it. I read because it feeds my soul. I work for you because it pays my bills while I build my future. I don't need you to validate any of that. I never thought. That's exactly the point, she interrupted. You never thought about it at all. And now that you are, you're wondering if that makes you a bad person. She straightened her collar. But that's your journey to figure out, not mine. The sounds of the party filtered through from the main house, laughter, music, the clink of glasses. Jake's world was in there, waiting for him to return and take his proper place. But standing here, watching Tasha prepare to leave, he felt that world's foundations shifting. The moment crystallized when Mark's voice carried down the service corridor. There you are, Jake. Still consoling the help. He appeared at the entrance, drink in hand, several other guests trailing behind him like an audience gathering for a show. Something in Jake snapped. Maybe it was the smirk on Mark's face, or the way Tasha's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "That's enough, Mark." "Enough what?" Mark's voice carried that familiar tone of privileged amusement. "Come on, Jake. The joke's gone on long enough. Let's get back to the real part." "Why?" Jake stepped forward, positioning himself between Mark and Tasha. "There is no joke. There never should have been." "Oh God, you're actually serious." Mark laughed, looking at the other guests for support. "What's next? Are you going to tell us she's actually a princess in disguise?" "No," Jake said, his voice rising. "She's actually a human being. Something you seem to have trouble recognizing." The words came out louder than he'd intended, drawing more attention from nearby guests. Mark's face darkened. "You've lost your mind. Think about what you're doing. Think about who's watching." "I've spent my entire life thinking about who's watching," Jake shot back. "Making sure I said the right things, knew the right people, laughed at the right jokes. Even when those jokes were at someone else's expense." The corridor had grown crowded now, guests gathering to witness the confrontation. Tasha remained silent, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. "You're going to throw away years of friendship, years of business relationships, for what?" Mark demanded. "Because your maid can quote some artists and wear a nice dress." "My name is Tasha," she said quietly, but her voice carried. "And I've never needed Mr. Thompson or anyone else to defend me. What I find interesting is how threatened you are by someone you consider beneath you." Mark turned red. "Threatened? By you? Don't flatter yourself. Then why work so hard to put me in my place?" Tasha asked, her calm voice a stark contrast to Mark's agitation. "Why does it bother you so much that I can hold a conversation about art or literature? That I can design my own clothes? That I can walk into this party and be treated as an equal?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jake looked around at the faces of his friends and business associates. Some looked uncomfortable, others intrigued, a few openly hostile. He realized with sudden clarity that he didn't care what any of them thought anymore. "You know what the real joke is, Mark?" Jake said. "That I invited Tasha here to humiliate her, but she's shown more class and dignity than anyone else in this room. Especially me." After the confrontation, Jake retreated to his private study, loosening his tie as if it could release the tension in his chest. He poured himself a drink with shaking hands, spilling expensive scotch on his equally expensive desk. The room suddenly felt suffocating, every piece of art on the walls, every leather-bound book on the shelves, every carefully chosen status symbol seemed to mock him. He could hear the murmur of the party continuing without him, his guests undoubtedly dissecting what had just happened. Tasha followed him in, closing the door behind her. "You didn't have to do that," she said simply. "I know." Jake slumped into his chair. "But I'm starting to realize there are a lot of things I didn't have to do. Like inviting you here tonight to humiliate you. Like spending years pretending to be someone I'm not just to fit in with people like Mark." "Who are you then?" Tasha asked, remaining standing. "When you're not trying to impress anyone." Jake stared at his drink. "I don't know anymore. I've spent so long playing this role, the successful businessman, the perfect host, the guy who has everything figured out. But tonight..." He trailed off. "Tonight you saw the cracks in the facade," Tasha finished for him. "It's uncomfortable when our carefully constructed worlds start to crumble." "I just lost half my business contacts out there," Jake said, gesturing toward the party. "Probably more. The Barrett deal is definitely dead. My father would be horrified. Are you more worried about losing the deals or losing the illusion?" Tasha's question cut through his self-pity. Jake looked up at her, really looked at her. "How do you do it? Walk into a room full of people who want to see you fail and still hold your head high?" "Because I know who I am," she answered. "My worth isn't determined by what people like Mark think of me. Or what you think of me, for that matter. I don't even know what I think anymore." Jake stood up, pacing the room. "Everything I've built, everything I thought was important, it all feels hollow now. But I'm terrified of losing it. That's the real conflict, isn't it? Tasha observed. Not between you and Mark, or you and your social circle. It's between who you've been pretending to be and who you could be if you stopped pretending. Jake stopped pacing. I don't know how to be any other way. Yes, you do, Tasha said. You showed it out there when you stood up to Mark. That wasn't the men who invited me here to humiliate me. That was someone else entirely. The weight of her words settled over him. Outside, he could hear Mark's voice, still loud, still angry, rallying others to his side. The familiar pull to go back out there, to smooth things over, to slip back into his comfortable role was strong. The aftermath of Jake's confrontation with Mark spread through the party like wildfire. Groups of guests huddled together, speaking in hushed tones that fell silent when Jake passed. Some began making obvious exits, offering thin excuses about early meetings or family obligations. Thomas Chen, who had been negotiating a major development deal with Jake, caught his eye and shook his head before walking out without a word. Sarah Blackwood, a prominent real estate investor, canceled their lunch meeting for the following week through a hastily sent text message. Mark had positioned himself by the bar, holding court with a group of influential friends. He's lost it completely, Jake overheard him saying. First defending the help, next he'll be giving away his properties to the homeless. The group laughed, but there was an edge to it. They were already distancing themselves, preparing for Jake's social and professional fall. Your phone's been busy, Tasha noted, watching Jake check yet another message cancellation. 20 years of relationships unraveling in 20 minutes, Jake replied, pocketing his phone. The Barrett Group just pulled out of our development deal. That's $50 million gone because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. Because you showed humanity, Tasha corrected. There's a difference. Another group of guests made their way to the door, barely acknowledging Jake as they left. These were people who had been at his house countless times, who had celebrated holidays with him, who had called themselves his friends. I should have known better, one woman stage whispered to her husband as they passed. New money never quite understands how things work. The comment was meant to be heard. Jake watched as his carefully cultivated social circle crumbled. The remaining guests had divided into clear camps, those who were openly hostile, those who were uncomfortably trying to stay neutral, and a small minority who seemed genuinely impressed by his stand. Your real estate empire was built on these connections, Mark announced loudly from his position at the bar. Good luck maintaining it now that everyone knows you've gone soft. Your father would be ashamed. The mention of his father hit Jake hard. He had spent years trying to prove himself worthy of the Thompson name, to show he could be as successful, as respected, as powerful. Now he was watching it all slip away. They're not just ending social relationships, Jake said quietly to Tasha. They're ending business partnerships, investment opportunities, deals that have been years in the making. They're making sure I understand the cost of stepping out of line. And yet you're still standing here, Tasha observed. Not running to apologize, not trying to play it off as a joke. That's interesting. Jake realized she was right. Despite the mounting losses, despite the very real consequences playing out before him, he felt no urge to recant or backtrack. The cost was enormous, but somehow, standing there watching his old life crumble, he felt more like himself than he had in years. As the party reached its lowest point, with guests streaming out and Jake's professional life seemingly in ruins, Tasha stepped forward. The remaining guests, still gossiping about Jake's apparent social suicide, fell silent as she clinked a crystal glass for attention. Since we're all discussing authenticity and social standing, she announced, her voice carrying across the now quiet room, I think it's time I added my own truth to the evening. She placed her glass down deliberately. My full name is Natasha St. Clair DuPont. The name hung in the air for a moment before recognition began to dawn on several faces. Mark, who had been mid-sneer, suddenly paled. Yes, Tasha continued, as in DuPont Designs. As in the daughter of Marie DuPont, who revolutionized modern fashion before her death 3 years ago. She smiled slightly at the shocked expressions. The same daughter who disappeared from the fashion world after refusing to sell her mother's company to corporate investors. Jake stood frozen, pieces falling into place, her knowledge of design, her sophisticated understanding of art and culture, her perfect poise under pressure. It hadn't come from books alone, it had been her birthright. I chose to step away from that world, Tasha explained, addressing the stunned room. I wanted to understand how people behave when they don't know your name or your net worth. To experience life without the weight of expectations and prejudice. She turned to Jake. Though ironically, I found different kinds of prejudice instead. Mark sputtered, his face cycling through shades of red. You're lying. This is some kind of trick. You can Google it, Tasha replied calmly. My disappearance made quite the headlines. Heiress abandons fashion empire. The photos are still online. She pulled out her phone and displayed a magazine cover showing her at a Paris fashion show, standing beside her mother. The room erupted in chaos. Guests who had been heading for the door suddenly found reasons to linger. Those who had snubbed Jake minutes earlier began trying to catch his eye. Mark looked like he might be sick. The ultimate joke, Tasha said, turning to Jake, isn't that you invited your housekeeper to a party to humiliate her. It's that you had one of the most influential names in fashion cleaning your house, and like everyone else here, you never saw past your own assumptions. Jake stared at her, seeing her fully for the first time. Why? Why work as my housekeeper when you could? When I could what? Live off my inheritance. Run a corporate fashion empire. I chose to step away, to see the world from a different perspective. And I learned more about people in one night here than I did in years of charity galas and fashion shows. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The woman they had looked down on, had tried to humiliate, had more social standing and wealth than most of them combined. So, Tasha said, addressing the room but looking at Jake, who's ready to talk about real authenticity now. The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, every assumption, every judgment, every carefully maintained social barrier lay shattered on Jake's expensive marble floors. And in the wreckage, both he and Tasha stood unchanged, perhaps the only authentic thing at the entire party.